There exists a window in every relationship with an avoidant person, a brief period before their patterns solidify into immovable defenses where certain questions can penetrate their armor and force confrontation with truths they've spent a lifetime avoiding. This window closes quickly, usually within the first few months of recognizing their avoidant patterns, before they've fully activated their defenses against you specifically. Miss this window, and the questions become useless, deflected by walls so thick that no inquiry can breach them. But ask during this critical period and something remarkable happens. The avoidant person cannot answer, not because they're unwilling, though resistance is part of it, but because these questions point directly at the architecture of their attachment wounds in ways that bypass their usual intellectual defenses. The questions don't attack or accuse. They simply ask the avoidant person to examine and articulate the mechanics of their own patterns. This examination is something they've avoided their entire lives, something their whole psychological structure is designed to prevent. When forced to attempt it, the avoidant person experiences profound discomfort that manifests as inability to formulate coherent responses. They stumble, deflect, become irritated, or go silent. This reaction isn't weakness or proof they don't care. It's evidence that the questions have reached something real, something protected, something they cannot access or articulate without dismantling the defenses that feel essential to their survival. Understanding these questions and when to ask them provides a final opportunity for the avoidant person to develop insight into their patterns before those patterns destroy the relationship entirely. What are you actually afraid will happen if you stay close? This question strikes at the core of avoidant attachment by asking the person to identify and articulate the specific fear driving their need for distance. The avoidant person experiences closeness as threatening, but this threat operates largely outside conscious awareness. They feel discomfort when relationships become too intimate, urgency to create space when someone gets too close, relief when distance is established. These feelings are automatic and powerful, but the avoidant person rarely examines what exactly they're afraid will happen if they don't create that distance. The question forces this examination, and the avoidant person discovers they cannot answer because the fear is pre-verbal, rooted in attachment experiences before they had language to describe or understand what was happening. When asked this question, the avoidant person's first response is usually deflection. They might say they're not afraid of anything, that the question doesn't apply to them, that they simply prefer independence and space. This deflection is automatic defense against the vulnerability the question demands. Acknowledging fear requires admitting that their need for distance isn't rational preference, but protective mechanism against something that feels dangerous. The avoidant person's self-image centers on being rational, independent, and not controlled by unconscious fears. The question threatens this self-image by suggesting that their behavior is driven by fear they haven't examined rather than conscious choice they've made. If pressed past the initial deflection, the avoidant person might offer surface-level explanations that don't actually answer the question. They might say they're afraid of losing themselves, of being controlled, of having their freedom restricted. These answers sound meaningful, but remain abstract and intellectual. They describe what they think they're afraid of, without touching the actual emotional experience driving their behavior. The real fear is deeper and more primitive. The fear that intimacy means annihilation, that being fully known means being rejected or abandoned, that vulnerability leads to unbearable pain. These core fears are too threatening to articulate or even fully feel, so they remain buried beneath intellectual rationalizations about independence and autonomy. The avoidant person's inability to answer this question reveals how disconnected they are from their own emotional experience. They've spent years, often decades, developing strategies to avoid feeling their feelings about closeness and vulnerability. They've intellectualized their responses, creating narratives about valuing independence that obscure the fear underneath. When asked to identify the specific fear driving their distance, they encounter a blank space where self-awareness should be. They genuinely don't know what they're afraid of because they've never allowed themselves to examine the fear directly. The examination would require the very vulnerability they're organized around, avoiding. This question is most powerful when asked early in the relationship, during the phase when the avoidant person is still somewhat open and hasn't fully activated their defenses against you. If asked during this window, the question creates cognitive dissonance that's difficult to resolve. The avoidant person recognizes that their inability to answer suggests something important about their patterns. They feel the fear the question points to, even if they cannot articulate it. This feeling, brought to conscious awareness through the question, creates brief opportunity for insight and potential change. The avoidant person might begin recognizing that their need for distance is driven by fear rather than authentic preference, that their patterns serve protective function rather than reflecting who they actually want to be. But if the question is asked too late, after the avoidant person has fully activated their defenses, it becomes ineffective. The avoidant person dismisses it as psychoanalytic nonsense, accuses you of trying to pathologize their healthy need for independence, or becomes angry at the implication that fear drives their behavior. The defensive response prevents any genuine self-examination. The window is closed, and the question cannot penetrate defenses that are now specifically constructed to protect against your influence and perspective. This is why timing is critical. The question must be asked while the avoidant person is still somewhat receptive, before they've categorized you as source of pressure and threat requiring maximum defense. The value of this question lies not in getting satisfactory answer, but in the avoidant person's struggle to answer it. The struggle itself is revealing and potentially transformative. When they cannot articulate what they're afraid of, when they feel the fear but cannot name it, when they recognize the disconnect between their intellectual justifications and their emotional reality, they encounter their own patterns directly. This encounter is uncomfortable but necessary. Most avoidant people go through entire lives without ever examining the fear driving their relationship patterns. They simply enact the patterns automatically, leaving a trail of confused and hurt partners who never understand what happened. The question interrupts this automatic enactment and demands conscious reflection. If the avoidant person responds to their inability to answer with curiosity rather than defensiveness, the question opens possibility for growth. They might acknowledge that they don't know what they're afraid of, but recognize they should explore this. They might begin therapy to examine their attachment patterns. They might start noticing when the fear arises and what triggers it. This curiosity-driven response is rare because it requires the avoidant person to tolerate significant discomfort without immediately defending against it. But when it happens, the question serves its purpose, creating awareness where blindness existed, introducing doubt where certainty protected them from self-examination. More commonly, the avoidant person responds with defensiveness that shuts down the conversation. They become irritated at the question, dismissive of its premise, or withdrawn from the interaction entirely. This defensive response, while disappointing, also provides valuable information. It reveals how threatened the avoidant person feels by direct examination of their patterns, how little capacity they currently have for the vulnerability that self-examination requires. This information helps you understand what you're dealing with. Someone whose defenses are so rigid that even gentle inquiry into their patterns feels like attack requiring protection. This understanding allows realistic assessment of whether the relationship can develop the depth and intimacy you need, or whether it will remain constrained by the avoidant person's inability to examine themselves. Can you describe a time you felt safe, being vulnerable? This question approaches the avoidant person's patterns from a different angle, asking them to access memory of vulnerability that felt safe rather than threatening. The question is deceptively simple, but profoundly difficult for avoidant people to answer, because most have no such memory. Their attachment history typically involves vulnerability being met with rejection, dismissal, or burden on the caregiver. They learned early that showing needs or expressing feelings created problems rather than connection. This learning shaped their entire approach to relationships, teaching them that safety comes from self-sufficiency and emotional independence, rather than from interdependence and vulnerability. When asked to recall a time vulnerability felt safe, the avoidant person searches their memory and finds primarily experiences that confirmed vulnerability was dangerous. The avoidant person's struggle to answer this question manifests differently than their struggle with the first question. With the fear question, they typically deflect or intellectualize. With this vulnerability question, they often go silent, genuinely searching their memory for experience that matches what's being asked. This silence is telling. It reveals how rare, possibly non-existent, such experiences have been in their life. The avoidant person might eventually offer something, usually an example that doesn't actually involve emotional vulnerability. They might describe accomplishing something difficult or facing a physical challenge. These examples demonstrate courage, but not the emotional vulnerability the question asks about. If the avoidant person understands the distinction and continues searching for genuine emotional vulnerability that felt safe, they might recall something from early childhood before their avoidant patterns fully formed. A moment with a grandparent who was more emotionally available than their parents. A friendship in adolescence where they briefly let someone see their struggles. These memories, if they exist, are usually fragmentary and tinged with sadness because they represent rare exceptions in a life otherwise characterized by emotional self-protection. The sadness comes from recognizing how little safe vulnerability they've experienced, how isolated they've been, even when surrounded by people. More commonly, The avoidant person cannot identify any time vulnerability felt safe. This inability is confronting because it highlights the absence that has shaped their entire relational life. They've never experienced the feeling of being fully seen and accepted, of sharing their deepest fears and finding compassion rather than judgment, of expressing need and having it met rather than dismissed. Without this foundational experience, they have no internal template for what secure attachment feels like. They cannot trust that vulnerability will lead to connection rather than rejection because they have no experiential evidence supporting that trust. Their avoidance, viewed from this perspective, is perfectly logical defense against repeating painful experiences they've already had too many times. The question serves multiple purposes. First, it creates awareness in the avoidant person about what they've missed, what normal development includes that they didn't experience. Many avoidant people go through life believing their experience is universal, that everyone finds vulnerability threatening and uncomfortable. Discovering that others have memories of safe vulnerability challenges this assumption and introduces possibility that their experience isn't universal norm, but specific history that shaped specific patterns. This awareness, while painful, is necessary first step toward change. Second, the question reveals whether the avoidant person has capacity to access and discuss emotional experiences. Some avoidant people, when asked about safe vulnerability, can connect with the sadness about its absence in their life. They might express that they wish they had such experiences, that they recognize something important is missing. This emotional accessibility suggests capacity for the internal work necessary to develop more secure attachment. But other avoidant people respond to the question with continued intellectualization or irritation. They might dismiss the question as irrelevant or claim that not everyone needs to be vulnerable. This dismissal suggests more rigid defenses and less capacity for the emotional exploration required for change. Third, the question implicitly invites the avoidant person to create new experience of safe vulnerability in the current relationship. By asking whether they've ever felt safe being vulnerable, you're pointing to possibility that such safety could exist between you if they're willing to risk it. Some avoidant people recognize this implicit invitation and respond to it. They might acknowledge they've never felt safe being vulnerable, but express curiosity about whether it could be different in this relationship. This openness creates opportunity for you to demonstrate that vulnerability doesn't lead to the negative outcomes they've learned to expect. The timing of this question is crucial because the avoidant person can only access vulnerability with someone they haven't yet fully defended against. Early in the relationship, before they've categorized you as threat to their autonomy, they might be able to share their lack of safe vulnerability experiences and the sadness connected to that absence. This sharing creates intimacy and understanding that can deepen the relationship. But later, after their defenses are activated, the same question triggers only defensiveness. They interpret it as criticism, as you pointing out their deficiency, as pressure to be more vulnerable than they're comfortable with. The question becomes weapon rather than invitation, and they shut down rather than opening up. If the avoidant person responds to this question with genuine reflection and acknowledgement that safe vulnerability is missing from their experience, you have valuable information. You know you're dealing with someone who has some self-awareness, who can access their emotional reality enough to recognize what's absent. This self-awareness suggests possibility for growth and change if the person is willing to do the necessary work. You can decide whether you want to be patient while they develop capacity for vulnerability, or whether you need to be with someone who already has that capacity. But if the avoidant person responds with dismissal, irritation, or claims that vulnerability is overrated and unnecessary, you also have valuable information. You know you're dealing with someone whose defenses are rigid and who isn't currently capable of the self-examination necessary for developing secure attachment. This knowledge allows you to make informed decision about whether to continue investing in the relationship or to recognize that the person cannot currently offer the emotional intimacy and vulnerability that genuine partnership requires. What do you think you're protecting by keeping distance? This question shifts focus from fear and past experiences to present moment behavior and its function. It asks the avoidant person to examine what their distance-creating patterns are designed to protect. The question assumes, correctly, that the patterns serve protective function, that they're not random or arbitrary, but purposeful strategies for managing perceived threat. By asking what's being protected, the question invites the avoidant person to examine the core self they're trying to keep safe through their avoidance strategies. This examination is profoundly difficult because it requires seeing their patterns as defensive rather than as authentic expression of who they are. The avoidant person typically responds to this question with confusion or deflection. They might say they're not protecting anything, that they simply prefer a certain amount of space and independence. This response reflects their genuine experience of their patterns as preferences rather than defenses. The avoidant person doesn't feel like they're protecting something. They feel like they're simply being themselves. The suggestion that their need for distance is protective strategy rather than authentic preference threatens their self-understanding and typically triggers resistance to the question itself. If pressed past initial deflection, the avoidant person might offer surface-level answers. They might say they're protecting their independence, their freedom, their sense of self. These answers are technically accurate, but remain too abstract to be meaningful. The question is trying to get at something more specific and vulnerable. What aspect of self feels so fragile that it requires constant protection through distance? What would happen to this core self if protection was removed and intimacy was allowed? These deeper questions are what the avoidant person cannot answer, because doing so would require vulnerability they're organized around avoiding. The protection the avoidant person is typically maintaining operates at unconscious level and relates to core sense of worthiness and lovability. Deep in their psychological structure sits a belief, usually formed in early attachment experiences, that their true self is fundamentally unlovable or unacceptable. They learned that expressing needs led to rejection or burden. They learned that showing emotion created problems. They learned that vulnerability was weakness that others exploited or dismissed. These lessons taught them that their authentic self, the part that needs and feels and wants connection, must be hidden to maintain relationships and avoid rejection. The distance they create protects this hidden self from being exposed and rejected again. But The avoidant person cannot articulate this protection because it requires acknowledging the core wound they've built their entire defensive structure around. Admitting they believe their true self is unlovable means feeling the pain of that belief directly. The avoidant person's patterns exist precisely to avoid feeling that pain. They've spent years developing strategies to never have to sit with the fear that if someone truly knew them, that person would leave. Answering the question honestly would require dismantling these protective strategies and confronting the wound underneath. This feels impossible and dangerous, like removing armor during battle. The question's value lies in planting seed of awareness that the distance is protective rather than preferential. Even if the avoidant person cannot answer the question directly, even if they deflect or become defensive, the question introduces the idea that their patterns serve function beyond what they consciously recognize. This idea might germinate slowly, leading the avoidant person to begin noticing moments when their need for distance arises and what triggers it. They might start recognizing that the distance increases when they feel vulnerable or exposed, when someone gets too close to seeing parts of themselves they keep hidden. These observations can build toward insight that their patterns are defensive rather than authentic expression of their needs and preferences. The question is particularly powerful because it reframes the avoidant person's distance as protection rather than rejection. Many avoidant people feel misunderstood by partners who interpret their withdrawal as lack of care or interest. The avoidant person knows they do care, but cannot explain why caring doesn't translate into closeness. This question offers framework for understanding the disconnect. They create distance, not because they don't care, but because caring makes them vulnerable, and vulnerability activates their protective patterns. Understanding their distance as protection, rather than indifference, can create compassion for themselves and insight into their patterns. When asked early enough, this question can catalyze the avoidant person's curiosity about their own patterns. They might begin therapy to explore what they're protecting and why. They might start reading about attachment theory and recognizing themselves in descriptions of avoidant attachment. They might become more mindful of moments when they feel the urge to create distance and what's happening emotionally in those moments. This curiosity-driven exploration is the only path toward developing more secure attachment patterns. External pressure to change never works with avoidant people because pressure triggers their defenses. But internal curiosity about their own patterns can motivate the difficult work of examining and changing those patterns. If asked too late, after the avoidant person has activated full defenses, the question typically triggers anger or complete withdrawal. They interpret it as accusation that something is wrong with them, as pathologizing of their healthy boundaries, as intrusive demand that they explain themselves. The defensive response shuts down any possibility of productive conversation. The avoidant person retreats further into their patterns, now viewing you as source of pressure and threat. The question, which could have created insight if asked during the window of openness, instead reinforces their belief that relationships are dangerous and people try to control or change them. The most telling aspect of this question is often not the content of the avoidant person's answer, but their emotional response to being asked. If they respond with curiosity, even uncomfortable curiosity about what they might be protecting. This suggests some capacity for self-examination and growth. If they respond with irritation or dismissiveness, this suggests more rigid defenses and less capacity for the vulnerability required to examine their patterns. Both responses provide crucial information about whether this person is capable of the relational depth you need, or whether their patterns are too entrenched to allow genuine intimacy. How would your life look different if you let someone all the way in? This final question is the most confronting because it asks the avoidant person to imagine the very thing their entire psychological structure is designed to prevent. Letting someone all the way in means allowing themselves to be fully known, needs and fears and vulnerabilities all visible. It means trusting that this exposure won't lead to rejection or exploitation. It means experiencing sustained intimacy without the relief valve of distance to manage their discomfort. For most avoidant people, this imagined scenario isn't desirable future, but nightmare scenario their patterns exist to avoid. The question asks them to describe this nightmare as if it were positive possibility, creating profound cognitive and emotional dissonance. The avoidant person's response to this question reveals whether they can even conceive of deep intimacy as potentially positive. Some avoidant people, when asked this question, immediately describe negative outcomes. They imagine feeling suffocated, controlled, losing themselves, being consumed by the other person's needs. These negative projections reveal that the avoidant person's nervous system codes intimacy as danger rather than safety. They cannot imagine a scenario where being fully known leads to positive outcomes because their attachment history provided no experiences of deep intimacy being safe or nourishing. Every template they have for what happens when someone gets close involves negative consequences they're determined to avoid. Other avoidant people respond to this question with genuine confusion. They don't understand what letting someone all the way in would look like practically. What does that even mean? How would it manifest in daily life? This confusion isn't strategic deflection. It's genuine inability to envision intimacy they've never experienced. The avoidant person lacks internal reference point for deep emotional closeness. They've organized their relationships around maintaining distance, and they cannot imagine what life would be like without that organizing principle. Asking them to describe it is like asking someone who's never tasted chocolate to describe its flavor. The experiential knowledge required to answer simply doesn't exist. Occasionally, an avoidant person responds to this question with tentative hope. They might acknowledge that letting someone all the way in sounds frightening, but also acknowledge curiosity about what it might be like. They might express that part of them wonders whether the intimacy they avoid could actually feel good if they allowed it. This hopeful response is rare and precious because it indicates the avoidant person has maintained some connection to their attachment needs despite years of defending against them. The hope suggests that underneath the defensive patterns exists longing for connection, a part of them that knows isolation isn't what they actually want, even though it's what feels safe. The question forces the avoidant person to confront whether their patterns are serving them or limiting them. If letting someone all the way in would make life worse, as their immediate negative projections suggest, then their patterns are protective and appropriate. But if letting someone in might actually improve life, might provide connection and intimacy, that would be nourishing rather than threatening, then their patterns are limiting them and preventing access to experiences they actually want. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it challenges the avoidant person's entire narrative about their patterns being healthy preferences rather than defensive limitations. When asked during the critical window, this question can create a powerful moment of clarity for the avoidant person. They might recognize that they don't actually know how their life would look different because they've never tried letting anyone all the way in. They might acknowledge that their fears about intimacy are projections based on past experiences rather than certainties about how current relationship would unfold. They might express willingness to experiment with more openness, to test whether their fears are justified or whether intimacy could actually feel different than they expect. This willingness creates opportunity for the relationship to develop differently than the avoidant person's patterns would typically allow. But the question can also trigger profound defensiveness if the avoidant person interprets it as pressure to be different than they are. They might respond angrily that they don't want to let anyone all the way in, that this is inappropriate demand, that you should accept them as they are rather than trying to change them. This defensive response often includes assertion that their need for distance is a healthy boundary that should be respected. They reframe the question as your problem, your neediness, your inability to accept reasonable limits rather than as invitation to examine whether their patterns serve them well. The most painful responses to this question come when the avoidant person acknowledges that letting someone all the way in would probably improve their life, but asserts that they cannot or will not do it. They might recognize that their patterns isolate them and prevent the intimacy they sometimes long for. They might acknowledge that keeping people at distance means missing out on deeper connection, but they assert that the risk of vulnerability feels too great, the fear too overwhelming, the protective patterns too necessary. This response is honest about the tragedy of avoidant attachment, knowing that connection would enrich life, but being unable to risk the vulnerability connection requires. This question is most valuable not because it produces satisfying answer, but because it forces the avoidant person to examine the cost of their patterns. Most avoidant people focus exclusively on the cost of intimacy, the vulnerability, the potential for hurt, the loss of autonomy, without examining the cost of their avoidance. The question shifts attention to what they're missing by keeping everyone at distance, what experiences they're preventing through their protective strategies. This shift in focus can create motivation for change that didn't exist when they were only aware of why intimacy feels dangerous. The timing of this question is absolutely critical because it determines whether the avoidant person experiences it as invitation or threat. Asked early, during the window of relative openness, the question invites the avoidant person to imagine positive possibilities they haven't considered. It suggests that this relationship might be space where different outcomes are possible, where letting someone in might not lead to the negative consequences they fear. Asked late, after defenses are activated, the same question feels like demand or criticism. The avoidant person interprets it as you saying they're deficient, that they're not giving you what you need, that they need to change to satisfy your requirements. This interpretation triggers maximum defensiveness and withdrawal rather than any genuine self-examination. These 4 questions create a map of the avoidant person's internal landscape, revealing the fears, wounds, and protective patterns that govern their relationship behavior. The questions cannot be answered easily because they point to psychological territory the avoidant person has spent their life avoiding. But the inability to answer is itself revealing and potentially transformative. When asked during the critical window, before defenses fully activate, these questions create opportunity for insight and change. When asked too late, they trigger defensiveness that reinforces patterns rather than disrupting them. Understanding this timing is what makes the difference between questions that open possibility and questions that close it, between intervention that might catalyze growth and attempt that only confirms the avoidant person's belief that relationships are threatening spaces where people try to control and change them. The window is narrow and it closes quickly. Don't be late.